These are available online already. I didn't put them in my slide, like I didn't put them on the profile for this talk yet on the camp website, but it is on GitHub. If you search for my name, Ryan Weal, it'll be on my GitHub page. It's called Offline if you go through that route, or you can access this URL. This URL will take you straight into the slides. Oh no, actually this one is the GitHub profile. But you can get to the slides just by clicking through online, and it will just open in a HTML JavaScript thing, so we don't need to have a special format.
Wow,
So no, it's just GitHub. So it's all a README file actually. So if you just want to scan the page, it's the whole talk. So anyway, my name is Ryan Weal. I drove down from Montreal, and this is, I think, my third or fourth DrupalCamp New Jersey. So good to be here again. And in the past, I've done Drupal migrations a lot. I was more of a back-end developer for the past 4 years, and over the course of the summer, I had some downtime, so I thought I'll learn new things. And the thing I ended up learning was how to do offline websites. And since I travel a lot, this is something that's kind of familiar and frustrating to me often when the example I like to use is you like open up a bunch of tabs, you get on the plane, and you're like, okay, I'll read that tab, and you open the tab, and it's dead because the browser tries to reload the page. So this talk will like show you the technologies around making that content available offline so that once people hit the page, it's available to them. There is a note here that this is the second version of this talk, so I've tried to address some of the questions from the past round and brought those into the discussions, so hopefully that will be good. So it's always funny when you get to a camp because like this morning, the internet's already down. And the last time I presented this at Bad Camp was the day that the IoT devices swarmed the internet and killed the DNS. So it's like, yes, this is relevant again. So since we have...
Are you just sabotaging things to make your talk more?
Clearly that's, yes, I'm all powerful. I've got 8 arms. But there's a lot of different scenarios. Like you could be on an aircraft, you could be without data in a foreign country, which is quite common. Data is expensive if you're doing that. It often happens on subway systems or metro where you're underground and there's just not a cell phone underground tower. Other times it's just that networks are really slow. And I've been recently looking into how to improve performance globally on some sites. And it's very interesting to see how, like, the further you go away, the longer things take, and at some point you get far enough away and it just doesn't work. So these are, like, considerations that we have that we've all been overlooking because we've been building websites that are for, like, when you are online. So there's ways that we've been getting around this, and that's largely been, like, either making everything online only or doing a native app, which means that we're developing multiple things for our clients. And then, as I said, with distance, you start to get more latency, and it adds up. So we've got like server-side caching and reverse proxies and CDNs and aggregating our resources and all of these things. And then the BigPipe module I mentioned here is a Drupal 8 module that's included in core. And it pushes down like the site's theme aspects first. And then if slow content is slow to arrive, like Facebook, it will like show up later in like a predefined chunk. So these are things that we've been doing. So like with all that in mind, we should say, okay, well, how should we start planning for this if we want to do this? You want to like first like narrow down like what it is you really want. So if you were building a website for DrupalCamp, you would say, well, I want the sessions to be available offline so that when people are at the event, if they're international and they don't have data, they can still browse everything. If there's like functionality that's intended to be online, can you sync that later? So I use a service called Toggle to track my time. And their old version had this really great offline capability, and the new version, I think they've started rolling it out. But what it does is it just caches all of your submissions until you're online, and then it just pushes them all up. It's like really kind of obvious, but it's like, it's a different way of thinking. There's this module that is available for Drupal 8 that Acquia published called Water Wheel, and I haven't done a ton of work with this yet, but it's basically a REST API client that kind of takes care of some of the basic scaffolding. So that's something you may want to be thinking about if you have some synchronization you want to do with that and not have to worry too much about the overhead. And another consideration is the fallback content. So what happens when you don't have something? So do you tell people, hey, you're offline right now? If you've gone to Twitter's website and you're offline, you'll see that the feed is blank if you're offline, but the rest of the site is still there. And it just says, you're offline, which is kind of cool. And we're going to talk about how to do that type of thing. There's more considerations on top of that. So if you're wanting to do this, you're often going to be packaging up stuff and pushing it all down to the user at once while you have them online. So you have to consider how much content can they take at that one time. Because if you're spinning for 10 seconds, a lot of people are just going to close the window and move on. So you kind of need to make sure within that first hit, when I'm giving them the offline content, how long are they going to spin for? And you need to account for, like, not everyone's on the fastest connection, not everyone is in the New York area if your server is in New York, things of that nature. You also have storage limitations on the device, and the device is really the web browser, and each web browser kind of has its own rule for how much that is. So 5 megabytes is kind of a nice number that will just work, but some of the browsers will support 50, some will support 250. And then you have this other thing called IndexedDB, which I haven't used yet, but there's tons of wrappers that let you implement it with a very simple JavaScript add-on. And IndexedDB will pretty much let you do whatever you want, from what I understand. But again, I haven't looked into it too much because my data needs have been very light. So lastly, I kind of asked this question, do you need a desktop application as well? And that's like, we're talking about really like making our web content available really in any browser, but there's also this other idea out there that like you could do a desktop application in the same way that we used to do, or that let's say we used to do apps for phones. So there's a way to spin all that together too. It's called Electron. The Atom editor by GitHub was like built with this. It's like the Chrome engine, but it packages into a desktop application for Windows, Linux, or Mac. And I recently built one, so it's doable, it's fun, it's pleasant, so that's nice. But anyway, we're getting down to just one code base for all of our options, so that's very nice as a developer. So lastly, before we get into the technical details, there's some other considerations that we have that are like, okay, we already do this. If you work on sites that have security implications that need PCI compliance, you're often doing same origin policies, trying to like narrow down like, I want all my stuff to come from these domains, plus YouTube, or something of that nature, just so that there's no risk that people are running their own JavaScript in the console and doing nefarious things with your stuff. So we already kind of designed in this way where we're like, I just want to give this person all the stuff they need. So you have to think about like, well, I can only provide offline for this one domain because this is the one I control. So bring all the things you need for your offline users into that domain. That's the main point of this. There's like things that are quite similar in a way, like the XML sitemap module lists out all the files we're going to see in the next slides. That a large part of what we're going to be doing here is simply just listing out what things we want people to go and download. So I put a little asterisk beside Ajax because you kind of don't want to be doing Ajax, but then in theory you could with the service worker technique, and we'll see that toward the end. So first of all, there's two methods to do this. There's Appcache and there's Service Worker. And Appcache is the only one that works in Safari because Apple doesn't want the application-like experience for websites because they want you to build an app, which sucks. It's a very simple file called a manifest file. It lists out the resources that you want people to download. You set an index on it. Basically, anytime this file changes, all of the content gets pushed down to the user again the next time they hit the site. while they're online. It does just work. It's very simplistic. It really is like, you are going to get all this stuff. I'm making no decisions. Here it is. Deal with it. So in that way, it's very limiting. So it's overly simplistic. But one of the questions I got asked last time is, can I do both of these things? And the answer is yes, you can. So if it works and it's very simple, great. So I took some time off this summer and I thought, well, before I get into Drupal and make this all super complicated, let's just do it in HTML. And we just ended up with a few files. We've got an index.html, we've got a .appcache file, which I had to make sure that Apache, in my case, was aware that Appcache was, it's not like text HTML meta, or it's something to consider that you may need to configure your web server, but most of them, I think, work by default. So, and yeah, I did some JavaScript. So I just made this little demo app. It's kind of crappy, but it works. This one's using Vue.js 1. And there's like a snapshot of the HTML. And you see that at the top there, in the HTML statement, there's a manifest parameter with the name of the file that also lives in the root beside this file. So that's really all it is in the HTML side. And then the manifest file just looks like this. It calls itself cache manifest. It has a list of assets. The network statement is, we're just going to catch all the requests, I believe is what this means. There's a couple additional lesser used things. I honestly wouldn't get into it at this point because this is already deprecated in the browsers that we're using. We're only using it because Safari hasn't updated. So it's kind of like use the minimum and just like push down your assets. So using that Twitter example that I mentioned, basically you push down your theme and your basic content regions. And that's kind of what you'd want to be doing with this in most cases for Drupal. So there's a little look at my app. And if you want to just go and like analyze the code in detail, it's on GitHub. When you're debugging an Appcache app, you kind of want to always keep the console log open. It will tell you if there's like things that are going wrong. It's Control-Shift-J to open the console if you're not a front-ender. Often reload twice. It's a weird thing, and I think it's going to get worse because Chrome has changed the way that it's going to deal with reloads, where it's going to first just check the timestamp of only index.html, if that's the file you're looking at. So reloading twice tends to be useful. It sounds dumb, but it's trivial and it works. So that's great. And I say update the serial number. The serial number is just any text string that you want. Like as long as this .manifest file has a new timestamp, the user is going to get new stuff. But you see, I have V11s. Some people put in like a date stamp. Just anything changing is good if you want to update your cache. So that's, as I said, very overly simplistic. You can't say that like main.js is new. You're just like, boom, everything's new again, download it all. So that's kind of sucky. So there's some further reading here. Sorry about the title of the last one, but it's kind of the most epic blog post on this subject. Application cache is a douchebag. It's published by Jake Archibald, and his name will come up again because this post covers all the stuff you're going to run into if you're doing Appcache. Like, why is it this way? This isn't really what I want, but I'm going to have to do it this way? I guess so. And that article covers it. So I think that's a great place to start. There's also this offline_app module in Drupal. And it was made for Front-End United to demo the DrupalCamp scenario. Front-End United is a front-end camp in Europe each year. And basically what they did is they made an alternate theme and made their session schedule available to people. So you could, in this case, they separated it out to a separate URL. And if you click the, like, I want this offline, then it would go to that URL, which would simply fetch all the data. Great. So I went and looked at how to configure all of this. And it kind of suffers from the same problems that Appcache itself does, where there's a lot of assumptions, and it's kind of quirky and all this stuff. So all the content, if you use this module, goes under the path/offline in your Drupal site. It presumes that you have only one level beyond that. So like offline/page one, not offline/article/page one. No, no, no. That's 2 levels deep. No, no, no. So something to, just be considerate of these things if you want to use this module. Because the manifest file is so simple, you may just want to do your own thing with it. That's why I'm putting it out there, is that it's like very deterministic on what you're doing with it. So it blocks the theme from rendering. So you'll see in the next slides that you just get this like really blank, ugly pages, and you have to do a separate CSS file. So with the front-end United site, they did like just a different style where it was just a much simpler layout. And the way that they framed it was like, this is the offline content. So you could kind of appreciate why it was more simple. It adds 3 block regions to the site, and it's aware of, but it doesn't really do anything with the images. I think that's pretty common to all of the Drupal solutions that are out there. It won't let you do the homepage as a fallback. I forget why I put that in there, but it's something that was definitely in the issue queues when I was reviewing that. So just things to be aware of. Basically, if you're going to go with this particular module, everything's going to be under that offline folder, and it's 1 level deep. And we'll just take a couple quick looks at what this is. You have some permissions to add. You have the blocks that I mentioned. You want to put stuff in those blocks, clear your caches, rebuild them. And then you would configure your content types, and it's basically display modes. And I won't go into too much detail on this because we're kind of time limited, but essentially you have this interesting syntax where you want to say your node path is, okay, so these last 2 lines here, I want to create offline/beauty as a path, but what I want to do to actually create that is put in the settings beauty/node1. So beauty is the alias, and node:1 is actually the path. You can see this is kind of awkward. It's like, I want that slash to be a slash in the path, but no. So anyway, it's a little bit weird, but it's just view mode, so it's very familiar stuff. If you were to do it with views, again, you just use an offline display mode. And in your configuration, you address things in a similar way where you use like colons and slashes to kind of separate out these details and make aliases. So if you follow these, so articles/view, so view : super awesome : offline_1 is, if I went into views and I made that offline view and I clicked on it, I would see in the URL that that view mode of that view is called offline_1. The view name is super_awesome, and then view means it's a view. So that's what's going on there with those paths. And that's just a quick look at the configuration for it. I was really tempted when I got here to like click that first manifest tab and just try doing stuff, and what I really wanted to be doing was working with the content tab. And that's where all of those paths get created. So you can set your like offline homepage and offline menu, what to do if you have certain images you want to include. And then because there's no theme, it's beautiful. You can see I just did a very simple demo. So we have a homepage, we have a list page, which is our view called super awesome, and then we have our beautiful node. And it's just like really, really simple. New nodes don't get added automatically. You have to go and manually do each one. Style sheets are a problem because when you regenerate your style sheets, the path might change. So that is something that sucks if you're like, maybe I'll just put those CSS paths into my manifest file, and then you blow away your cache or you change some things, and then those paths no longer exist. So if you wanted to take that route as a cheat, you might want to have some tests or something to run after you do stuff so you make sure they're still there. You can prompt the user to reload. There's JavaScript snippets out there, and there's some resources I'll point you to at the end which will like lead you in those directions. But essentially, once you hit that, whatever file references that manifest everyone's just going to download everything, and it's going to be beautiful, and it's going to work. So here's a discussion about what was done. I think this was a different group than, it's not the Front End United post, but a different one that was published by an agency. I think they're in India, I can't remember. But anyway, Agile Drop made this post around the last time I did the presentation. It was really helpful just to get a quick overview of like what the actual settings are. It's very good for like, okay, this is what the offline_app module needs for setup. So there's a bit more detail than I've provided in the slides here. Okay, now Service Worker is where it's really at. So if you're like me and you were doing backend for 4 years and you've been living under a rock, you kind of missed all of this stuff. But this has been around for like 5 years. It's just that it's now really kind of available everywhere. So we can finally use it. And the buzzword or the phrase of late is progressive web apps. And it's changing every day. There's stuff I added yesterday that was just announced this week. So we'll get to that. But the main idea is that you can add it to your home screen. So you're like visiting this page and it's instantly functional to you on your mobile phone. And the way that Google's recommended code works is that they're not going to prompt you to install right away. It's like come and use the app a few times, but not within 5 minutes. Like it's got to be spread out. And if you come back like 3 times, it's like, hey, I see you like this, so do you want to add it to your home screen? So it's trying to be really elegant. And it works very similarly in that the idea is you push down your theme. They really try to encourage you to do a loading icon so that you can go and query the rest of the stuff. And it's a little bit like BigPipe in that way. But it gets really a lot more complicated. So
BigPipe is an experimental as of 2 days ago. Right?
I think in 8.3 it's now stable. And nothing changed, which is great news. So I have, again, example code, and this has since been updated. But there's this just raw HTML version that I did that's the most simplistic thing I could make so that I could make sure I understood what I was talking about before I presented it. So the main changes, the manifest file is now a JSON file. And you have to use JavaScript to register the service worker. So if JavaScript's not running, it's not going to do anything. What's neat is I recently found out that it will, when the registration process happens, it will look, is there any app cache? And if there's an app cache, it will kill it. I don't know if it's going to download twice, though. So that's maybe a question. I don't know how. I haven't tested to see if it tries to do both things. But if Service Worker wakes up and says, hey, there's an app cache here, it's going to push it aside, take over responsibility. So that way you can do both. So you can have your cake and eat it too. There's 3 main keywords that kind of encompass the universe of Service Worker. So it's not just here's a list of files. It's I have 3 states. I have install, which is pretty obvious what that means. So you run these things when you install, and that's where you fetch all the main content. And then there's activate. And activate means when you reboot your device and you haven't yet started that application, the first time you start it, that's an activate event. So that event is where it's recommended to look for a new version if you're online. And the last time I presented this, I thought, this code doesn't work. It actually blew up on me on my way to the event. When I was on the flight, I was like, it's not available. And I found a way to fix that. It was that my service worker wasn't correctly registered, and there's now a tool to use to fix that and find out about that. So we'll talk about that in a bit. And then the last state is fetch. And fetch is really interesting, and this is where it's possible to do AJAX within your own site. Fetch, what it does is every time you request a URL with service worker, rather than going straight to the internet, first it hits fetch. And you can say, if the path is this, serve it from this cache key. And you can set up multiple cache keys to cache different things if you want. You can intercept any URL coming in and then triage it. I want this to go internet first. I want this to go local storage first. And there's a reference that I have at the end called the Offline Cookbook. And they have examples of like all different scenarios. So you can actually use fetch to like race the two options. You can be like, try the disk and try the network, and whatever comes back first is what I want. Like, you can really do whatever you want with it, which makes it super complex, but it's kind of, most of the time you're going to just use the example code and say, go look in the database. If you have this URL, serve it. And if not, then go to the network. And that's kind of what most people want, but you can do much, much, much more. So you've got like a nice fallback for that you can always just route certain URLs only to live, which is great. And you can provide a fallback if you don't have that in your offline, if you have some URLs that are always like, must be online for those. Yeah, next slide. So there's that was the last version of this demo app that I did. When I ran it through the utility to test it, it said, that title isn't contrasty enough. You didn't label the input so that people are accessible, can't access it. And actually, I can show you maybe. No, it's not going to let me do it. So now I have a darker green for the top, and it says, type a new note above that little window so that I pass all of Google's tests. And I changed the theme as well. But there's a how-to that I reference at the end that has this like baseline CSS template that looks like Android that Google gives you just to say, here you go, if you want to start, you can just use this, and good luck. And then you see it stands out as a separate application in your switcher if you launch it off your desktop icon. So that's very nice for me. Like, I use this as a task list, this little app that I built, and you'll see on the, it's really tiny, but I have it open in Firefox, I have it open in Chrome, and then I have it as its own distinct app. And as its own distinct app, it has its color that it's set in the JSON file, and it's going to work in all the contexts basically. But what I did is I went into Chrome and said add to home screen, and that did it. So I actually did this on my desktop recently too. I was like in Chrome, and you know there's that little apps button? Do this. Oh, actually, I think I had to go through. No, wait, I had to go. I viewed the application, and then I did Control-Shift-J, and then somewhere in the utilities, on the application tab, you can click the Add to Home Screen button, and it put it into my GNOME desktop in Ubuntu, so it's just in my Ubuntu drawer of applications now, and it works as a native app there as well. So that's kind of cool. There's some new news on this, which is, well, maybe I'll just talk about it here. Right now, at the moment, these are basically just a wrapper for Chrome. In the next version of Chrome, which is to be released very shortly, they just announced this week that these will now generate APK files so that they show up in the application drawer, not just as an icon on the home screen. And if you go into the settings, you'll see how much storage is using. You can force it to quit. You can like remove all the storage for it and do all those things that you can do with native applications. So that's coming like this week. And if you do the notifications, they will be branded as your application, not as though you are using a Chrome service. So that's kind of neat because it's going to be more real. There's this great page that, again, Jake Archibald put together, and it's Is Service Worker Ready? It's going to have a breakdown of all the browsers and what features are available to those browsers. So pretty much with the exception of Safari, you're going to get all the Service Worker stuff. I think the notification, like popping up windows on people and stuff like that, I think that isn't as widely supported, but for what we've been talking about so far today, pretty much works everywhere. Edge has a couple limitations, but it's been gradually improving. And let's not even talk about IE. IE is dead. Microsoft doesn't support it, or at least it's phased out very soon for the remaining versions. There's this. So you can do both, and there's this one neat thing that I found, and they named it after Jake Archibald. It's called Appcache, and what it does is it takes a manifest file, like for Appcache, and with this JavaScript library attached to your page, it will actually create service workers that do the same techniques that Appcache does, so you only do one config. I really like the the post, because at the end of their README file, it says that they have too much beer and too much coffee, and I always love both of those things. So kind of comical, but this is what our code actually looks like now. Oops. You see that our JavaScript file just has a cache name that I created. Could be anything. You could have multiple, as I mentioned before. And then I put a list of the URLs that I want cached. So that's pretty simple. And then we have our install. And this is, again, just from a Google example. It's referenced at the end of the document. So add event listener, install. And then we have an anonymous function. We do a console log so we can see stuff is happening. And we add all the files in the cache file I created to our cache. So it's really simple. It just says, go get these 5 things, put them here. So this is the activate function. And as I said, the last time I presented this wasn't working, and it would blow up if I was on a plane and I rebooted my phone. So it turns out that the service worker wasn't actually registered, which is why it was failing that. So there's a utility that I think I mentioned in 2 slides from now. It's called Google Lighthouse, and it's just a plugin for Chrome. I think it needs 56 and up. So I have 2 browsers, and one of them is a bit too old, and one of them is new enough. So you can install that utility, and when you point it at your application, your service worker URL, you run the test suite, and it will give you all those tips, including the color contrast and the did you label all of your inputs and all of these things. But more importantly, it shows you if your service worker is actually fully registered. The bug that I was actually doing was I was referencing the root URL, but I'm hosting on GitHub pages, so I was actually in a folder. And for a while that was okay, and that kind of worked. And then they were like, somehow at some point, something got more locked down, and it started doing what it should have did, which is fail. So the activate function is just going to do any cleanup or housekeeping that you want to do on first boot. So in this case, it's going to look to the network. If it sees a newer version, it's going to pull it down. If it doesn't see the network or it doesn't see a new version, it's going to serve from the cache. So it only looks at boot up. It's pretty much a good time to do it, because usually you're often online if you're booting up. So now the fetch request is, again, it's just to add an event listener called fetch with an anonymous function. And in this case, we're taking the request and we're just running it against our caches and seeing if there's a match for that URL. And if there is, we're serving the cache. And if not, we're doing whatever else we want. Again, this offline cookbook is a really great resource. He's got so many examples of things you could do with this, like race the network against the disk, or only serve from the disk, or only serve from the network. So, lots of debugging things. You really need HTTPS for the service worker to work correctly. It won't work in dev unless the URL is explicitly localhost. Not like localhost.whatever or whatever.localhost. No, only localhost. Not even a local IP, just the word localhost. So if you have HTTPS, it's just going to be a lot easier. So that's something to be mindful of. Again, watch your console logs, because that'll scream at you right away. Like, you're not on HTTPS, and this is not called localhost. I'm not doing anything. So just like Control-Shift-J and like watch the console. In the Chrome inspector, there are ways to do this in Firefox, by the way, but I just kind of am heavily addicted to Chrome right now. Chrome://inspect, and then there's service workers. It's going to give you a list of all the service workers that are running on your laptop or desktop or whatever, and you'll find like, oh, Twitter has a service worker running on my machine in the background 24/7. What's that doing there? And what's this other site that I've been to that has a service worker? But more importantly, you can just kill it. And then what that will do is the next time you reload, it's going to be a fresh hit. So you're not going to be hitting the cache at all if you destroy your service worker that's running. There's a second one, service worker internals. I forget what the difference is, but you can look at both of those and you'll see advanced detail. Yeah?
No, the service worker is already running, and presumably if you don't kill it using the inspector, And you disable JavaScript in your browser? What happens?
I don't know. I'm not sure. That's a good question. I don't know.
It seems like it will still run.
I would think it might. I don't know. Haven't tested that.
You should be able to completely turn JavaScript off inside the browser, but unless you explicitly kill any service workers that were previously spawned,
Yeah.
they should just keep chugging away for 24/7.
It probably would. Yeah, I don't know. I haven't tested it, but that's a really great consideration when you're debugging things. And then there's the URL to that Google Lighthouse. It's more of a discussion page, how to introducing it. You can get it in the Play Store is where it actually lives. It's a cute little lighthouse icon. Ta-da, you know. So similar to the app cache, by default, it's just going to push down all the content at you. But as you've seen from the fetch and the install commands, and the fact that you can define multiple cache keys, and just in your fetch, you could say, check that cache, check this other cache, check that other cache. Okay, now error out. So you can design around this. So you can push down the frame of the site, let people use that, and then as they do more things, you can gradually build up other caches. So that's a way to design around. In the offline cookbook, there's example code for how you can detect how much space is available on the device that you're pushing content to. So if you see that the device is limited to 5 megabytes, maybe you only push the frame of the website and you don't bring anything else, for example. This is kind of a quirky thing. There's no reload button or other things. If you're in development mode, you could pull down and it will do the reload command, but most of the Chrome stuff is kind of hidden away. So you're gonna need to make a way to do a reload if that's something that's important to your application. So it's JavaScript-y stuff. And again, use the Lighthouse utility. It's really useful because it's going to tell you all these little things that you can do to improve it without a lot of hassle. So it's always good to test your stuff. These are the 2 modules for Drupal, and I really question whether I should just strike the second one because it's kind of dead. Looks like it was a demo, and then it just was okay, let's call this PWA. So this PWA one, I'll talk about on the next slide. It's a bit more detail. It's basically going to do the install hook. It's going to you have a few options for how to start up the app. So if you make an icon, basically it's to make an icon for your Drupal site is kind of what it does. And you can set some basic stuff for your theme or whatever you want to do to populate a bit of the cache. And it's aware of the images, but it doesn't cache them by default. And the cache key, because it's kind of presumptive that you're going to have one cache that you're using, but as I mentioned, you can do many. One criticism that I saw in the issue queue, it's hard to update. So what's sort of interesting about this module is that Nod, who's the developer, is the JavaScript maintainer. I don't think I've met him before, but there's a discussion ongoing that this could go into Drupal core as an experimental module for people, kind of targeting camps as a good example, to just say, if you're building a campsite, turn this on and your sessions will be offline. That's kind of maybe we could do that cool thing and just have kind of an example module out of the box in Drupal core. It's a discussion, and I have the URL handy on the next slide. We've already talked about the new features, so there's a bit more description. Oh, so yeah, you can now, so in the next version of Chrome, it will be an APK file to go in the application drawer. It will do all those native app things, have the force quit and all that stuff. But you can't submit that APK to the Play Store. So it's a good thing or is it a bad thing? I know that with the Apple Store or the iTunes Store, it's you have to go through a review board. The nice thing is you never have to do a review board because people just go to your website. On the other hand, a lot of people just go to the store to look for apps. So that's something that kind of sucks, but maybe it's kind of for our own good because we're not bound by the terms of service of the app stores anymore. Here's the link to the discussion in Drupal core, so you can go there if you wish and make a comment. I've refrained from making a comment because it's like, I don't know do we want that in core? It's kind of a neat idea, but if it's presumptive about what it does, maybe it'll just like limit people's thinking on it, or maybe it will open their minds. I don't know. This is why I'm not the person in charge. Some good further reading. So a lot of these examples come from this Google Code Labs discussion, making your first PWA app. I don't know. Oh, PW app is how they put it in the URL. Adding Service Worker and offline into your web app. So yeah, these are both Google Code Labs. They have example code, starter things. They're probably a year or two or even more old. So some of this stuff like Lighthouse may not be mentioned, but it will work with these, and the code is still relevant. So don't be dissuaded by the fact that some of these things are 5 years old, because we've been waiting for 5 years to do this stuff. So the offline cookbook, again, Jake Archibald. So I need to meet this person someday. The web app install banners, again, sample code. That's, as I said, it's going to say, have you been to the site multiple times, but not just the last 5 minutes, but you've actually come back here a few times. So that code is there. I mentioned Electron. If you were like, I built this thing so that things could be offline on a phone, what if I want it offline on my desktop? You could just package the whole thing in Electron. You wouldn't really need the service worker stuff. It could even be half of this talk in the future, I don't know, but I recently have done a project with Electron, and I really loved it because I haven't done front end for 4 or 5 years, and I have one browser to target. It's like, awesome. Does it work in one browser? Yes, ship it. It's like, beautiful. And it was weird too, because I haven't used Windows since like the 90s, but I made a Windows application using HTML and JavaScript for a museum installation. It was like crazy cool, but it was just a really simple like web thing that I'm very familiar with. So Electron is like, so we have this really small code base. It's maybe like, I want to say like 50K or less. But the application, if you render it on Electron, is like, I think it's like 80 megabytes on Linux and 170 on Windows, and the Mac OS was like somewhere in between. I think it was like 160 megabytes, something like that. So you really have like Chrome, like everything in Chrome. And the neat thing about it is that by default, when you set up a project, it's going to open up the console, the regular Chrome console, like right there. And once your application is all ready, you can just disable like doing that part. And for the case that we were working with, we actually just started up in full screen mode, which is great because at the museum they don't want kids like, you know, let's break everything at the museum. So that's pretty much it. Sorry, that was really fast talking, but we're to the minute. So we have time for questions, if you want. Yeah?
So you mentioned Toggle and their ability to queue submits. What's your opinion on these techniques and being able to queue submits?
I loved it until they broke it with an update, and then I.
Well, like the techniques that you've demonstrated here, how do they handle the queuing of submits?
It's pretty much just transparent. What they did with Toggle, and like I said, they rethemed, and so it kind of broke, and they're now like re-implementing it. But for the first like year I used it, it was like I didn't even notice. I was just like plunk, plunk, plunk. And if I was on an airplane, it would, if I clicked on the reports tab, it would say like, no, 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 you're offline. The only thing we're going to let you do is click on the add time button. Mm-hmm. And it would have whatever was cached there, and I would just add stuff. There was an icon that would show if something hadn't synced yet. And then finally, when they went to do their update, I was like, sync, sync, sync. Reboot the phone, sync, 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 and it wasn't syncing. And so I just took down my totals, and like, I forget exactly what I did, but basically I blew away those entries, and I was pretty sad. And then I, pinged them on Twitter, and they were like, Oh yeah, it's broken. We're fixing it. It's going to come back like a little bit after the 2.0 theme rollout. So it's like, unfortunately, it's an afterthought. But for me, that became critical functionality. It was like the main reason I stuck with them was that I'm often on a plane, and I love to work on a plane because I just have to focus. So,
But is like the PWA module like sophisticated enough to allow the Drupal developer to deal with offline submits?
I think you would have to fork it, and like it doesn't do any like interactivity on its own.
Okay.
I think the method that you would want to do is you would like make a custom service worker module for Drupal, specify like the stuff that you want to cache and all that, and then like in some of your conditions, so in your fetch, you would route stuff depending on the network state, and say like if I'm offline, then just like throw these JSON objects in a bin for a while, and then when you're back online, you can resync. So I think if you look at that is service worker ready page, it will show you the status of syncing when you're not using it. That's a thing that can happen where the sync won't really happen until you're actively using the app in a lot of cases. But if you look at that is service worker ready page, it will give you a bit more detail about what's going to happen there. And that's why I mentioned that Water Wheel JS project of Acquia. I hadn't reviewed it the last time, and I really just gave it a quick review this time. It's like a REST API client, so really you could do it with anything. But they give you some scaffolding that kind of does what expected Drupal things are there. So I would kind of look at it as you have your little service worker application that calls out to Water Wheel, or if you're online, maybe passes you through to Drupal. It would probably just be easier to do it all with the REST client, which then kind of begs the question of, are you building a headless Drupal app? So, cool. And that was something I was always like, oh, why would I do that? And then all of a sudden I'm doing this, and I'm like, oh, I get it. Headless Drupal is like this, but you're using the REST client on the back end. So I kind of myself prefer to have one application. So I'd rather have like Drupal, and maybe if we're offline, then I'll have Water Wheel on the side, so I don't have to maintain a whole bunch of code bases. But it's kind of like different scenarios, different needs. So it depends on what features you want to tap into on the Drupal side.
Water Wheel also works with JSON API.
Yeah, are you asking or are you telling me?
No, I'm telling you.
Okay.
You don't have to use REST API if you don't know at all. You can use the JSON API.
Okay, cool. Yeah, sorry. This is new to me, that side of it. So
does Water Wheel, does that work in a service worker? Is that
it's just a JavaScript package. So, I mean, depending on how you bind your instance of it, you can communicate with it. So, yeah. It doesn't really have anything specific to service worker at all that I know of. So it's kind of just a separate thing. But if you bind your variables the right way and call them across the application, it's fine. So, other questions? Yeah.
So it seems like you're using this as a way of getting around using like a native app in a lot of cases, or like Cordova to
yes.
like, do this. I'm kind of curious if you have experience using interfacing with other parts of the native experience, like using Bluetooth integration or
no, unfortunately not.
the movement detector of the phone or anything like that.
I did talk with a Mozilla developer, Dave Callahan, I think is his name, he's in the Minnesota area. And he was in India for DrupalCon there, and he was showing us like all these things that we were like, wait, you can access the Vibrate API from the web, and like sound, which is pretty obvious because WebRTC has been a thing for a few years now, but that's not supported on Apple devices. So, but I guess the short answer, no, I haven't really used the advanced features. I have heard about Cordova, and I was excited at first, and then I kind of heard that people who have used it eventually run into limitations, and they're picking through like expansion modules that are not very well maintained, which is sucky, but Cordova basically is this like, take HTML and JavaScript and like port it to native apps, and then submit those to the app stores. So I envision that this is kind of going to be popular with anything that's banned from the App Store. That's, I think, where the real money is in the short term, is like, are you not allowed in the App Store? I got a thing for you. And then following that, it's going to be more popular with just like, I have a site, I want to narrow down my code bases and save some money. I think that's another big audience for it. But yeah, I don't know the status of like using Bluetooth or stuff like that.
I haven't been able to
Find out
didn't
more.
find anything for Bluetooth because I've been doing. We use the Vibrate API with like there's a Vibrate JS library that you just buzz whatever
Mm-hmm.
and speech synthesis.
Oh, cool.
So you can vocalize input and then have it repeat it back to you or whatever.
Push
But
notifications.
Push notifications is one.
Yeah. Push, you will want to check this is Service Worker ready page, I think. 'Cause that's, I feel like that's one where it's got some limitations on certain browsers. So.
You said that you had to you had to define the actual path for each asset.
Yeah.
Is there any way to do like a wildcard? So like if you had like a cache.
It's just a JavaScript file, so you could really do anything you want just to return that list. Where
Like a lot of frameworks package up your CSS and JavaScript files, but they put like a hash string on the end to make sure.
Yeah. As I said, like it's just a JavaScript array that's going in there. So like foreseeably, you could have a variable right before that like figures out what the dynamic path is and then populates it. So that's one method you can use. But yeah, that's a good idea actually. That would kind of solve the what do I do about my dynamically changing CSS names in Drupal 8. That would get you there actually.
Yeah, if you could just point it to the assets folder
Yeah.
or something and just know that everything in there is going to get pushed down.
Yeah, that's awesome, actually. Yeah, thank you for that idea. Stealing that idea. Yes. This is what camps are great for. Other comments, questions?
No, I think it's awesome. It's like whenever you show somebody a website and the content's just there right as they get there, it's a really amazing experience for them. So
Yeah, it's definitely way cooler than like hitting a site. It's become infuriatingly frustrating to me to go to sites that take longer than 5 seconds now. And I've started like on the path of like, well, after that IoT DNS disaster, I'm going to make my DNS better. And then, oh, well, now that I'm thinking more globally, how do I make everything generally faster? And then I'm getting it closer to like application performance, and I'm like, what we're talking about here is way easier than doing all of that. And it's resilient to network like problems. So it's like, well, that's like really useful to me. It's like, I travel a lot, so depending on what country I'm in, I may not want to burn all my data. And if I can just do something locally, then great. And I wait till I'm back on Wi-Fi and everything's great. And it's actually surprising too when you start running the numbers, like when you're in India or in South America, like 1 megabit a second is maybe all you get. And the latency is crap. And I've been running tests with all that stuff, and wow, we live in a bubble. Like if you go into DevTools and hit the network tab, when you hit that tab, it's going to disable the cache, and right beside it, there's a throttle option, and you can. I stumbled on this site that was like, let's look at how bad dial-up is 3 years ago, and like half the web is broken if you're on dial-up. So I was like, well, there's not even a setting in Chrome to even replicate dial-up, but you can go down to GPRS speed, which I looked at the profile of like what would a 56K connection actually be like in terms of latency, and it's actually pretty comparable to the GPRS setting in Chrome DevTools. And when I noticed that, I was like, wow, it really breaks like half the web. So if you're like in the city and you're developing all your sites, you may not even be getting in, like across your own state. Like it's entirely possible that like if a lot of people in a certain region near you are just getting like farm IDSN by like a whatever WiMAX type of thing, like still could be useful.
Yeah, I live in central PA. We both live in central PA. He gets high-speed internet. I get 1 meg.
Wow.
Over a mountain if it's not cloudy.
Yeah.
We live 15 minutes away from each other.
I grew up north of the Montana border, so I'm like, yeah. It dawned on me, I'm like, my mom probably can't get to my site. Like, that sucks. I mean, it's actually not as bad as, like, I imagine it, well, as I remember it, I guess I should say, because it's improved over the years. But it's still not great. Like, it's really amazing how we take for granted how performant things are now.
Probably
And-
run into it. We deal a lot with researchers who are down in labs underneath tons of concrete at universities, and there's nothing down there. And when they're trying to use your application or whatever, and yeah, they're screwed by their own building.
Yeah. Yeah, I drove from where I live in Montreal down to Plattsburgh, New York to like receive a package, and I'd never done an import before into my own country. So I was like, I don't know what to do. And they're like, did you print your receipt? And I was like, no. Okay, well, just show us your phone. Okay, no problem. There's 2 bars. And so I'm sitting there like, and they charged me $12 tax. And it was like, okay, thank you. And they were very pleasant and everything was nice. But it was just like, okay, next time I'm going to go to the coffee shop, like near my coffee shop, and just print out that thing. And that way I don't have to give anybody my phone or anything. But it was just one of those situations where I was like, well, of course I had the receipt available and I've written down the total, but like there's no way bill from Amazon. Thank you, Amazon. And like, you know, but they didn't take my phone and run off behind the scenes, so I was like, whew. But
Well, I think the issue in higher ed, at least, I have this idea of putting stuff on the net so people in effort can get to it, right?
mm-hmm.
Which is probably an even tougher sell in terms of getting your website running.
Yeah, there's like I subscribed recently to this service called maplatency.com, which is based in the EU, and there's some major latency in certain countries. Like Brazil is particularly terrible. India's like okay, but really if the server's in Europe, it's okay. If the server's not in Europe, but only in the US, it sucks. And like certain parts of Africa and Madagascar is terrible. It's just like, wow, why is it so slow? And then you start to wonder, okay, what's the political situation in these countries? Whatever, I don't know. So, or what is the international like transatlantic cable situation for this country? You know, it's like, I don't know about these things. I never even thought about them before until I started like doing like page load tests across the globe, and it was like, whoa. But part of what got me into this was I went to Colombia for DrupalCon and I went to India for DrupalCon, and my site sucked. So yeah. Well, thank you for coming.